the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. In the month of October, we honor the Blessed Mother in a special way. Of course, she should be honored at all times and every month and every day and every moment of our lives. But in a special way in October, we celebrate feasts and celebrate her in a particular way. It's also the month of the Rosary, which again is something that should be prayed every day. Some pray it multiple times in a day and multiple mysteries in a day, but in a particular way in October we honor the Rosary as well. And so I would like to focus upon the Rosary in this month of October and the power of the Rosary and its origin. In speaking about the Rosary, I'll preface this by saying I will be speaking about the Rosary in its traditional form. The form of the Rosary that was given to the Church by the Blessed Mother herself, received by a great saint of the Church, personally received from the Blessed Mother, St. Dominic, and since then, for 800 years or so, has been a great instrument for the salvation of souls and for the destruction, if you will, of evil and enemies of God. I will be abstracting from any novelties or recent additions to the Holy Rosary. I will not be speaking about the luminous mysteries, which were given to the Church by Pope John Paul II. And so far as I know, he never claimed to have received them from the Blessed Mother herself, but offered them to the Church on his own behalf. But as traditional Catholics who favor the traditional forms of the Mass, the sacraments, and the prayers and practices and Rosary in particular of the Church, I will be abstracting from any novelties, additions, or changes. Again, as I noted, the Holy Rosary was given by the Blessed Mother herself at a time that she and her son judged it was opportune for the Church to have this instrument for salvation and weapon against the enemies of heaven. Some 800 years ago or so, in the 13th century, in southern France, the Blessed Mother appeared to St. Dominic, who years later would establish the Dominican order, which is known best for its preaching and for its crusade with the Rosary over many centuries, entrusted it to St. Dominic and described it to him as a psalter, if you will, of Ave Marias, of Hail Marys. Going back into the Old Covenant period, the common form of prayer for many of the Old Covenant people, and this remained true into the early centuries of the Church, the New Covenant people, were prayers drawn from the Psalter, the 150 Psalms that were given to the Church through the inspiration of God through King David. Many of the ancients had even memorized entire psalms, and some even the entire psalmody. And they would recite these in much the way that we now recite the various prayers and reflect upon the mysteries of the Holy Rosary. The Blessed Mother entrusted this psalmody of Ave Marias, or Holy Marys, to St. Dominic as a weapon against heresy. Among other things, it happened to be the heresy of the Albigensians, a new form of an ancient heresy which denied the divinity of Christ, as had been the case of the Arians centuries before, as had been the heretics even in the time of the Apostolic Church, as is evident in some of the apostolic writings. Among others, the evangelist St. John, more than any others, repeatedly gives proof and attestation to the divinity of Christ and warns against deceivers who would deny the divinity of Christ, whether in his own time here on earth as Jesus Christ in the mortal flesh, or whether in that apostolic generation, or any time thereafter, for that matter. The Albigensian heresy also looked down upon the physical material world, reminiscent of an earlier heresy, Manichaeism, out of which heresy God, by divine intervention, snatched the great Saint Augustine. These heresies are often collectively referred to as forms of dualism, in which an intellectual, spiritualized life is highly valued, and the physical, material world is looked down upon. St. Paul, in particular, condemned this view, noting that our bodies are intended for the resurrection and for a glorious state, and so the body in the material world does matter. St. Dominic found that he was not effective in combating the forces of this heresy, and so the Blessed Mother appeared to him and provided with him that weapon against heresy, the Holy Rosary. And so this man, who is later to be formally recognized as a canonized saint, was given this great instrument, a weapon against the enemies of heaven, an instrument of salvation for the saved. We know the power of the Rosary, and there is not sufficient time in this Mass, or even in this entire day, to list and cite all the examples of the power of the Rosary, first used as an instrument against the Albigensians. Also in this month of October, we recently celebrated a military victory that was accomplished through the power of the Rosary. It was a victory over the forces of Islam, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which sought to conquer, to overrun, overpower, and de-Christianize Europe. And Pope St. Pius V commanded that every soul should pray the Rosary in anticipation of the Christian forces of Europe to oppose this diabolical force coming mostly by sea. And outnumbered 3-1 by the aggressive forces of Islam, through the power of the Rosary, they were badly, terribly defeated and driven back. And at that time, so many hundreds of years ago, Europe was preserved from the hell on earth that Islam forces would have imposed. I suggest that now as much and even more than in the time of the Albigensian heresy, in the Battle of Lepanto, of which I just spoke, we face the same enemies perhaps more fierce now than ever, and perhaps poised for greater success than ever. We face something much worse than a single form of a heresy that denies the divinity of Christ and disdains human nature. We face a force that is really the totality of all heresies and more. A heresy that at its roots and stripped to the core would be seen to not only deny the divinity of Christ, but divinity itself. A force that sees all truth as mutable. A force that sees the human person as central, if not deified itself. It is a force that another Pope, St. Pius X, the last century, recognized and sought to rout out from the church and destroy. It went underground, but unfortunately, the infestation of modernist roaches is back in full force. They have crept in to every place and every church and every nation, to the very heights of the church itself. And sadly, there is no pope now who will call for all souls to pray the Rosary against this ultimate heresy of heresies. And sadly, with regards to the other enemy I mentioned, that of Islam, a diabolical religion, a political force, if you will, so too there is no pope and few churchmen who will call for all souls to use the Rosary as a weapon against a false religion. Not only a false religion, but a violent religion, and a religion that has as its core belief the domination of the world and submission of all to a truly false God. Hundreds of years ago, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of souls prayed the Rosary against the Ottoman Turks. And now, some 500 years later, very few souls are even in those churches, which for the most part are empties on Sunday in many places of France and Germany and elsewhere, whose pastors, whose congregations will probably soon, one day, happily and greedily sell off their churches to the successors of the Ottomans, happy to knock down the bell towers, break off and tear off the walls, the crucifixes, and shatter the stained glass windows, so that those worshiping a false god can inhabit what had been the Christian churches. We recognize the enemy within. We recognize enemies from without. They have gained in great power in this century, gathered forces since the last century. We may not be able to avert the enemies from without. We may not be able to convert the enemy from within. But it certainly falls to us as individuals, as spouses, as parents, as true Catholics, to pray the Rosary, to use it as a weapon against the enemies of heaven, to use it as an instrument for salvation, to pray the Rosary, to implore the Blessed Mother to look upon us, her spiritual children, to look upon the Church, to implore her to protect us, protect our families, whatever it is that in His divine providence God may intend and God may allow. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.